Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. Tonight's story is The Three Low Masses by Alphonse Daudet. This story was first published in 1869. This version was translated into English by Antoinette Ogden and published in Christmas Stories from French and Spanish Writers in 1892. As you may guess from the title, this story is about a Christmas Mass service and has many fragments of Latin. To Catholics who actually know what these fragments should sound like, I sincerely apologize. For non-Catholics, I don't think an in-depth knowledge of the service is necessary to enjoy the story at all, although it is possible that there are a couple of jokes I'm missing. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Part 1. 2 truffle turkeys, did you say, Garrigou?
Yes, my reverend, 2 great, glorious turkeys stuffed with truffles. I ought to know something about it, considering I helped stuff them myself. I thought their skins would crack while they were roasting, they were stretched so tight.
Merciful saints! And I'm so fond of truffles, too. Hurry there, Garrigou, hand me my surplice. And what else did you see in the kitchen beside the turkeys?
Oh, all sorts of good things. Ever since 12 o'clock we've been plucking pheasants, hoopoes, hazel-hens, and heathcocks. From the pond they brought in eels, goldfish, trouts, and—
About how big were the trouts, Garrigou?
Oh, about so big, my reverend, simply enormous.
Holy Fathers, I can just see them. Did you put the wine in the vases?
Yes, my reverend, I filled them, but mercy, that isn't anything like the wine you'll have later, after midnight mass. You ought to see the dining hall at the castle, all the decanters glittering with the many-colored wines, and the silver, the plate, the chased centerpieces, the flowers, the candelabrum. I don't suppose there ever has been such a Christmas supper. The Lord Marquis has invited all the lords of the neighbouring estates. There will be over 40 at the table, leaving out the bailiff and the notary. Oh, my reverend, you are very lucky to be invited. The smell of the truffles haunts me now, simply from having sniffed at those turkeys. Come,
my child. Let us beware of the sin of greediness, particularly on the night of the Nativity. Hurry off now and light the tapers and ring the first call for Mass. It will soon be midnight and we can't afford to lose time. This conversation occurred one Christmas night in the year of our Lord 1600 and something, between the Reverend Dom Balaguer, formerly prior of the Barnabites and present chaplain of the Sires of Trinquelague, and his little clerk, or rather what he believed to be his little clerk Garrigou. For let me tell you that the devil on that particular night had assumed the round face and uncertain features of the young sacristan, the better to lead the reverend father into temptation and make him commit a great sin of greediness. So, while the would-be Garrigou rang out the chimes with all his might from the seigneurial chapel, the reverend father was slipping on his chasuble in the little vestry, and, as his imagination was somewhat excited by Garrigou's gastronomic accounts, he repeated mechanically as he got into his vestments, 2 roast turkeys, goldfish, trouts about so big. Without, the night wind blew and scattered the music of the bells. Gradually, lights began to pierce the gloom along the roads of Mont Ventoux, on whose summit the old towers of Trinquelague reared their mighty heads. The neighbouring farmers and their families were on their way to the castle to hear midnight mass. They climbed the mountain singing gaily in little groups of 5 or 6, the father ahead carrying the lantern, the women following, wrapped in great dark cloaks under which the children snuggled to keep warm. In spite of the cold and the advanced hour of the night, all these good people walked along merrily, cheered by the thought that a great supper was awaiting them as usual below in the castle kitchens after Mass. Every now and then, on the rough declivity, some fine lord's coach, preceded by torchbearers, showed its glimmering window panes in the moonlight, or then a mule trotted along shaking its bells, or, again, by the light of their lanterns wrapped in mist, the farmers recognized their bailiff and hailed him as they passed. Good night, Master Arnoton. Good night, my children. It was a clear night. The stars seemed brightened by the cold, the wind was nipping, and a fine sleet powdered all these cloaks without wetting them, just in order to preserve the tradition that requires Christmas to be white with snow. On the very crest of the mountain, the castle appeared like a goal, with its huge mass of towers and gables, the chapel steeple rising straight into the blue-black sky, while 1,000 little lights moved rapidly hither and thither, blinking at all the windows and looking against the intense black of the building like the tiny sparks that glimmer in a pile of burnt paper. After passing the drawbridge and the postern, in order to reach the chapel, one had to cross the first court, crowded with coaches, footmen, sedan chairs, and bright with the flame of torches and the glare from the kitchens. One could hear the clicking of the spits, the rattling of pots, the tinkling of crystal and silver as they were laid out for the banquet, and above it all floated a warm vapor smelling of roasted meats and the pungent herbs of complicated sauces, which made the farmers, as well as the chaplain, the bailiff, and everybody say, "What a good supper we shall have after Mass." Part 2. Ding-ling-ling. Ding-ling-ling. Midnight Mass has begun. In the chapel of the castle, which is a miniature cathedral, with intercrossed arches and oaken wainscoting up to the ceiling, all the tapestries are hung, all the tapers lighted. What a crowd of people, and what sumptuous costumes! Here, in one of the carven stalls that surround the choir, sits the sire of Trinquelagua, clad in salmon-colored silk, and around him all the noble lords, his guests. Opposite them, on velvet fall stools, kneel the old dowager marchioness in a gown of flame-colored brocade, and the young lady of Trinquelagua, wearing on her pretty head a great tower of lace, puffed and quilled according to the latest fashion at the court of France. Farther down the aisle, all dressed in black, with vast pointed wigs and cleanly shaven chins, sit Thomas Arnoton, the bailiff, and the notary, Master Ambroy, two sombre spots amid the high colors of silks and brocaded damasks. Then come the fat majordomos, the pages, outriders, the stewards, Dame Barbe with her great bunch of keys dangling from her side on a ring of fine silver. On the benches in the rear is the lower service, butlers, maids, the farmers and their families, and last of all, far back against the doors, which they discreetly open and close, come the cooks between two sauces, to catch a little whiff of the Mass, bringing with them into the bedecked church, warm with the light of so many tapers, odoriferous suggestions of the Christmas supper. Can it be the sight of these crisp white caps that diverts the Reverend Father's attention? Or is it not rather Garrigou's bell, that fiendish little bell that tinkles away at the foot of the altar with such infernal haste, and seems to be saying, "Come, let us hurry. The sooner we dispatch the service, the sooner we go to supper." The fact of the matter is that at every peal from this little devil of a bell, the chaplain forgets his Mass and allows his mind to wander to the Christmas supper. He evokes visions of busy kitchens with ovens glowing like furnaces, warm vapors rising from under tin lids, and through those vapors 2 superb turkeys, stuffed, crammed, mottled with truffles. Or, then again, he sees long files of little pages carrying great dishes wrapped in their tempting fumes, and with them he is about to enter the dining hall. What ecstasy! Here stands the immense table, laden and dazzling with peacocks dressed in their feathers, pheasants spreading their bronzed wings, ruby-colored decanters, pyramids of luscious fruit amid the foliage, and those wonderful fish that Garrigou spoke of, Garrigou, forsooth, reclining on a bed of fennel, their pearly scales looking as if they were just from the pond, and a bunch of pungent herbs in their monster-like nostrils.
This beatific vision is so vivid that Dom Balaguer actually fancies that the glorious dishes are being served before him on the very embroideries of the altar cloth, and instead of saying Dominus Vobiscum, he catches himself saying the Benedicite. With the exception of these slight mistakes, the worthy man rattled off the service conscientiously, without skipping a line or omitting a genuflection, and all went well until the end of the first Mass. For you must know that on Christmas the same officiating priest is obliged to say 3 Masses consecutively. "So much for one," thought the chaplain with a sigh of relief, and without losing a second he motioned his clerk, or him whom he believed to be his clerk, and ding-ling-ling, ding-ling-ling. The second Mass has begun, and with it Dom Balaguer's sin. "Come, let us hurry," says Garrigou's bell in a shrill, devilish little voice, at the mere sound of which the unfortunate priest pounces upon the missal and devours its pages with all the avidity of his overexcited brain. He kneels and rises frantically, barely sketches the sign of the cross and the genuflections, and shortens all of his gestures in order to get through sooner. He scarcely extends his arms at the Gospel or strikes his breast at the Confiteor. Between him and his little clerk it is hard to tell who rumbles the faster, the words half uttered between their teeth, for it would take too long to open their lips every time, die out into unintelligible murmurs. Oremus, mea culpa, papa. Like hurried vintagers crushing the grapes in the mash tuns, they both splashed about in the Latin of the service, spattering it in every direction. "Dom scum," says Balaguer. "Sturto," responds Garrigou, while the infernal little bell jingles in their ears like the sleigh bells that are put on stage horses to hasten their speed. You may well imagine that at such a rate a low Mass is soon rattled off. "So much for the second," says the panting chaplain, with scarlet face, in full perspiration, and, without taking time to breathe, he goes tumbling down the altar steps, and ting-ling-ling, ting-ling-ling, the third Mass is underway. Only a few minutes stand between them and the supper. But alas, as the time approaches, Dom Balaguer's fever of impatience and greediness increases. His vision grows more and more vivid. The fish, the roasted turkeys, are there before him. He touches them. Great heavens, he breathes the perfume of the wines and the savory fumes of the dishes, and the frantic little bell calls out to him, "Hurry, hurry, faster, faster." But how on earth can he go faster? His lips barely move. He's given up enunciating altogether, unless, forsooth, he chooses to cheat the Lord and swindle him out of his Mass. And that is just what he is doing, the wretched man. Yielding first to one temptation, then another. He skips one verse, then 2. Then, the epistle being very long, he omits part of it, skims over the Gospel, passes the creed unnoticed, skips the pater, hails the preface from afar, and thus, with a skip and a jump, plunges into eternal damnation, followed by that infamous Garrigou, Vade retro satanas, who seconds him with marvelous sympathy, upholds his chasuble, turns the pages 2 at a time, jostles the lectern and upsets the vases, while the little bell rings constantly, ever faster and louder. It would be impossible to describe the bewildered expression of the congregation, compelled to follow, mimicking the priest through this Mass, of which they can make neither head nor tail. Some stand while others kneel, some sit while others stand, and all the phases of this singular service are jumbled together along the benches in the greatest confusion of varied postures. The Christmas star on the celestial road, journeying toward the little manger yonder, grows pale at the very thought. "The abbé reads too fast. It is impossible to follow him," whispers the old dowager marchioness, whose voluminous headdress shakes wildly. Master Arnoton, with his great steel spectacles on his nose, loses his place every minute and fingers his prayer book nervously. Still, at heart, all these good people, whose minds are equally bent upon the Christmas supper, are not at all disturbed at the idea of following Mass at such breakneck speed, and when Dom Balaguer, facing them radiantly, exclaims in a thundering voice, "Ite missa est," the response, "Dio gratias," is so unanimous, joyous, and spirited that anyone might take it for the first toast of the supper. Part 3. 5 minutes later, the assembled lords, and the chaplain among them, had taken their seats in the great hall. The castle, brilliantly illuminated, echoed with songs and laughter, and the venerable Dom Balaguer drove his fork resolutely into a capon's wing, drowning the remorse for his sin in the savory juice of meats and the soothing draughts of old wine. He ate and drank so heartily, the dear good man, that he died of a spasm that very night without even having had time to repent. By morning he reached heaven, where the thrills of the past night's ecstasies lingered still in the air, and I leave you to imagine how he was received.
"Get thee gone, thou wretched Christian," said St. Peter. "Thy sin is great enough to wipe out the virtues of a lifetime. And so thou wouldst swindle us out of a mass. Very well, then. 300 masses shalt thou say, nor shalt thou enter into paradise until the 300 Christmas masses have been celebrated in thine own chapel, and in the presence of all those who sinned with thee and through thee."
And this is the true legend of Dom Balaguer, as it is told in the land of the olive tree. The castle of Trinquelacre has long ceased to exist, but the chapel stands erect on the crest of Mount Ventoux on a clump of evergreen oaks. The wind sways its unhinged door, the grass grows over the threshold, there are nests in the angles of the altar and on the sills of the high ogive windows whose jeweled panes have long since disappeared. Still, it seems that every year at Christmas, supernatural, mysterious lights hover among the ruins, and on their way to midnight mass and the Christmas supper, the peasants see this spectre of a chapel lighted by invisible tapers, which burn in the open air, even in the wind and under the snow. You may laugh if you will, but a wine dresser of the district, named Guerrigue, a descendant of Guerrigue, no doubt, has often told me that on one particular Christmas night, being somewhat in liquor, he had lost his way on the mountain somewhere near Trinquelacre, and this is what he saw. Until 11 o'clock, nothing. Everything was silent and dark. Suddenly, at midnight, the chimes rang out from the old steeple, strange, uncanny chimes that seemed to be ringing 1,000 miles away. Soon, lights began to tremble along the road, and vague shadows moved about. Under the portal of the chapel there were sounds of footsteps and muffled voices. "Good night, Master Oniton. Good night, my children." When they had all gone in, my wine-dresser, who was a courageous fellow, crawled up to the door, and there beheld a most marvelous spectacle. All these good shadows sat around the choir in the ruined nave just as though the benches were still there. There were fine ladies in brocades and lace headdresses, lords, gaily bedizened, peasants in flowered coats like those our grandfathers wore, all of them dusty, faded, weary. Every now and then some night bird, a habitual lodger in the chapel, wakened by all these lights, began to flutter about the tapers, whose flames rose erect and vague as though they were burning behind a strip of gauze. Guerrigue was particularly amused at a gentleman with great steel spectacles, who constantly shook his huge black wig, upon which perched one of these birds with entangled claws and beating wings. A little old man with a childlike figure knelt in the center of the choir and frantically shook a tiny bell which had lost its voice, while a priest, clad in old gold vestments, moved hither and thither before the altar, repeating orisons of which not a syllable could be heard. Who could this have been but Dom Balaguer, saying his third low mass? This story could have gone either way. It really depends. The frantic racing section of the service could have been comedic, or it could have been really horrible and nightmarish, and it really depends on how you read it, or how I read it in this case. And to be honest, I can't quite tell how Daudet meant it. The curse of St. Peter at the end seems kind of grim for a rather comedic little sin, and the setup at the end is like that of a ghost story. But it is also undeniably playful, and I think that a traditional ghost story would have begun with the ghost chapel and the spooky service, and then worked backward to the terrible sin that put everybody there. By the way, why is everybody else also damned to the 300 masses? Certainly it's not their fault. But, I mean, I don't know exactly how purgatory works. So anyway, I feel bad for Balaguer. I think we can all relate to being distracted by our appetites and the prospect of a lovely meal, particularly if it's one that comes once a year. As I record this, I am myself thinking about Thanksgiving next week, and yeah, I'm actually pretty excited about it. Is that really so bad? Or is the real sin the fact that he wasn't able to repent before he died? Of course, you know that I went poking around in the history of this story. There is a medieval chapel on top of Mount Ventoux, but I don't think there ever was a castle there. The family of Trinquilagua had a chateau in nearby Dijon, which they used as a summer residence. The chateau has quite a history, and it's still standing, but it doesn't match the history told in this story. So I think Daudet invented the story, or he modified it from other bits of local legends. He was from Nîmes. Actually, backtrack a little bit. Alphonse Daudet was born in Nîmes in 1840. His middle-class family lost all their money in a business failure when he was 14, so at 16 he got a job as a village school teacher. He hated it so much that it gave him nightmares for years afterwards, and after just a year he moved to Paris to live with his older brother. He became a writer. He wrote short stories and plays and novels, and he started working for a newspaper. He was also eventually appointed as a secretary to one of Napoleon's ministers. His literary career was kind of uneven. Some of the things he wrote went over well, and some flopped. He became known for writing very naturalistic characters, which was unusual in France at the time. The literature was more formal and more mannered. His popularity as an author kind of waned, and he was never particularly popular as a person. I think his wife, who was also a noted author, helped to kind of sustain his reputation in that regard. He was a philanderer, and he suffered terribly from syphilis for many years before dying of it at the age of 57. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. This week's confession is that, as you already know, this story has me thinking about holiday meals and Christmas dinners. I don't know if many Europeans know that Christmas dinner in the US is very idiosyncratic to individual families. Some people have it on Christmas Eve and some on Christmas Day. Some families focus a lot on Christmas morning breakfast. Some schedule the big meals around religious services or around sporting events. There isn't a specific dominant traditional Christmas meal or Christmas dish. Everybody kind of does it differently. Because the big focus of holiday meals is, of course, on Thanksgiving, which is far more consistent in terms of when it is served and what it contains. Although there is a lot of consistency around a Thanksgiving meal, people are very passionate about their potatoes and their pies. Several years ago, there was actually a funny series from the Bon Appetit channel where some of the chefs tried to convince people on the street of New York that roasted potatoes are better than mashed for Thanksgiving dinner. They make some really good points about roasted potatoes. I mean, it's lovely to have the crispy along with the creamy. And I can also see that if you were a chef, roasting potatoes is far more interesting than mashing them. But people were not having it. There must be mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving dinner. But even amongst mashed potatoes, there's a tremendous amount of variation. I like some of the skins in my mashed potatoes, and I like garlic and caramelized onions. I like a little bit of texture in there. But of course, some people are purists, and they just want white whipped potatoes, the texture of school paste. You know what I mean? Do you have a personal potato situation? Let me know. I'm curious. If you like holiday dinners and ghostly chapels and mashed potatoes, you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and choose notifications so you never miss a story. Please also give me a like or drop a comment below. I love getting feedback, and it does help other people find the channel. Thank you so much for your support, and I will see you in a few days.